When we get into the gut, there's obviously multiple mechanisms, right? The gut is a very simple and complex at the same time, right? It could be as simple as you want it to be, right? We eat food, it's broken down, nutrients are being absorbed, right? When you start diving into the details of our gut microbiome, the integrity of the gut, the secretions of different enzymes or lack of, malabsorption of certain nutrients. So we can dive into the gut, for hours and hours, but we're going to try to keep it as simple and focused on how does that impact our skin. Essentially, what we're looking at is some really interesting studies that are showing that there are three major mechanisms. One, when you have healthy bacteria in your gut, some of those bacteria species inhibit the activation of mast cells. Some of them also help us to regulate the immune system by expressing genes of anti-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin 10. Also, we know that when we have a state of dysbiosis or a shift between a healthy balanced bacteria, and now we either have less healthy bacteria and more, I would call it imbalanced bacteria or pathogenic bacteria. Now we have an imbalanced state in our gut, which leads to overstimulation of the immune system. There are multiple mechanisms in the way that happens, what we call dysbiosis. The third mechanism is immune response to foods. For example, a patient is either allergic to or they have sensitivity, right? Which is very similar to allergy, only it's a very mild reaction or a delayed reaction, right? Let's say I have sensitivity to either gluten, or let's say I have sensitivity to dairy, for example. It could be even things that are considered healthy. We've seen that happen. I develop a very mild reaction. I wake up the following morning, and that inflammation is building up, and I start getting itchy, I start getting inflamed, I start getting more and more of those histamine related symptoms. Sometimes it's hard for patients to pinpoint what it is because it was something that I ate yesterday. So it's really hard to know sometimes. That's why we have to learn about how to differentiate between allergy and sensitivity. 4 or 5 different tests for sensitivity. We can measure different aspects of the immune system, from antibodies to all the way to the reaction of the immune system, right? Of the white blood cells. So that's something we definitely dive into much more in depth into how to test and what are different tests that are available. And we know that the intestinal barrier has a really, really important role in maintaining integrity of the gut and preventing things such as bacterial metabolites or bacterial proteins like lipopolysaccharides from crossing into the bloodstream. That's what we call leaky gut, right? Things that are not supposed to be crossing, they now cross through the gut into the bloodstream. And so essentially the intestinal barrier is really maintained by groups of 3 innate lymphoid cells that produce T helper 17 cells. Let's call it TH17 to make our life easier. These work in different ways to help us to keep our gut in a healthy state. They modulate the antibacterial peptide secretion, and the secretion of IgA in the gut, and that kind of also helps us to prevent from the unhealthy bacteria to grow. But you also have to have healthy bacteria and feed those healthy bacteria, right? So there's multiple factors, obviously, that contribute to changes in your gut bacteria, can lead to dysbiosis, and that dysbiosis lead to a breach in the gut integrity and increased permeability. Some of those factors we already talked about, by the way. That's the environmental factors, environmental chemical or toxicants, dietary changes. For example, if your patient is living on fast food or they're not eating enough fruits and vegetables, they're not getting enough fiber. If we're not getting enough fiber, then how are we feeding those healthy bacteria in our gut? How are we making sure that those bacteria keep thriving and preventing opportunities bacteria from growing and taking place, right? So that's one aspect of our dietary consideration. We have to make sure that our patients are consuming enough fiber. In some cases, when patients having trouble because they're on the go or their schedule is tight, they're having trouble to add fruits and vegetables on a regular basis to each meal. Sometimes we'll even supplement them with inulin or some sort of fiber that they can mix with a glass of water and just get that extra fiber. There are some genetic predisposition. We talk a lot about more of that in the advanced functional medicine modules, where you can test and see, like, what is it that the patient, do they have certain genes that put them in more predisposition to develop gut issues? Some drugs, if your patient is in pain, they're taking NSAIDs, right? If your patient had consumed high dosages of antibiotics, even years ago, that could alter their gut microbiome. So all of those changes could lead to changes in the immune system, could change levels of tryptophan or lipopolysaccharides that leads to chronic inflammation. And as levels of Th17 response increases and the levels of the anti-inflammatory proteins like the T regulatory cells decrease or IL-10 anti-inflammatory decrease, now we are at a pro-inflammatory state. All we need is one or two more triggers to push our body towards inflammation that could be expressed in the skin. Another factor that is really important to remember is the secretion of the other particles in our gut. So, for example, in this picture that I'm going to present to you, and I love using pictures. We love using pictures when we educate and teach. These pictures help us to understand the process and concept. And so we're going to go from top to bottom. So you're seeing here the risk factors, environmental factors, dietary factors, not enough fiber, for example, or if your patient is consuming high amounts of sugar, right? It feeds the harmful bacteria, and some genetic factors. Those could lead to a situation in which we're altering the balance of the gut bacteria, which is called dysbiosis. And then there's a pro-inflammatory situation that could lead to a breach in our gut. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying it. There are a few more steps in between, learning how the tight junctions work and what activates them, what reinforce them to prevent this from happening, which nutrients prevent this from happening, which supplements can reduce that, right? So it's much more complex than that, but I'm simplifying this. Remember, environmental, dietary, we can also look at genetics, but we mostly want to look at the triggers that cause genetic changes. Now, I'm going to add another one to it, just in case you have a little bit of space in your brain left. There is also the issue of production of phenols. So the gut bacteria produces phenols, which is bioactive toxins that are created as part of the aromatic amino acids production. And these unfortunately have the ability to increase the proliferation of keratinocytes differentiation in the skin. So here's another connection between what's happening in our gut and the overproduction of those skin cells. And as we have hyperproliferation of those skin cells, you start getting more itchiness, irritation, scaling of the skin. So that leaves the patient with those scaling and redness, right? So we can look in the middle. You can also see we also have alternation in the immune function. And that's again because if the immune system sees those particles in our bloodstream that are not supposed to be there, then we have an overactivation of the immune system. In fact, there are some studies that claim that lipopolysaccharides, proteins in the external layer of the bacteria, when they are increased in amount in the bloodstream, they breach into the bloodstream in some patients, it can cause a very, very strong immune reaction. Of course, there's not going to be any pain that is associated with it, but that ongoing inflammation can definitely impact the organs, the skin, and lead to excessive inflammation and itchiness, right? So that's a major, major contributor. Now, if you want to read more about this, here's the resource. The study was published in 2020. It's called the Skin and Gut Microbiome in Psoriasis, gaining insight into the pathophysiology of it and finding novel therapeutic strategies. This was published in the Journal of Frontier in Microbiology. Of course, we love looking at studies, and we love to break down studies as we teach you guys about it and really simplify it and staying focused on the clinical application. Like, this is a cool study. Now, what do we do with it? To resolve the issue, of course, we have to look into the gut. And in some cases, in some patients, we might need to order specific lab testing, getting a snapshot of their microbiome, looking at some of the biomarkers, looking at the different short-chain fatty acids, looking at what type of byproducts are these bacteria secreting in our gut. We also look at the different enzymes that are produced by our pancreas, secretion of bile, right? All of those, level of acidity, all of those are really important to make sure that this state of dysbiosis doesn't occur. I'll give you another example. If you have a patient that is taking antacids, that reduces, right, the amount of stomach acid, which put them in predisposition for dysbiosis as well, right? So it's really important for us as healthcare practitioners to get a very comprehensive education. And then when we get the patient in front of us, understand the mechanisms and ask the right questions. So this was essentially what we call the gut-skin axis. And we have a whole training just on the gut-skin axis. But it's really important to understand this bidirectional connection. If you have changes in your gut microbiome, it could impact and influence the bacteria that lives on your skin. That could lead to changes in your immune response and the higher risk of developing skin conditions, right? We're talking about multiple skin conditions that are associated with the gut-skin axis. Some of them are psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, and acne. Really, the impact of the gut microbiome, this is a really interesting study that was published. You can read more about it. It's called The Impact of Gut Microbiome on Skin Health, gut-skin axis that observed through the lenses of therapeutics and skin diseases. So that's an interesting study published just recently. So now we understand that the connection between the gut and the skin is a bidirectional. When we have changes in our gut, that could lead to changes in our skin. And in between, changes to the metabolites that could impact the skin and changes to the reaction of the immune system. Now, let's take a look at this next picture. And this is a really interesting picture to show you that we also have histamine receptors in our gut. So we got H1, H2, and H4, for example, are found in multiple layers of our gut. And this is really important, from the mucosal membrane to the serosal membrane. In between, we have those different receptors to histamine. So when a patient eats the wrong foods that they have a reaction to, or they're exposed to certain environmental factors, or whatever it is that trigger their histamine release, it will not only cause a systemic reaction, but it will also impact the different layers of the gut. When your patient has activation of their mast cells, it could impact their gut. It could, one, aggravate the intestinal permeability. Second, it could lead to aggravate if they have gastrointestinal symptoms. That could aggravate that or lead to that. Of course, the underlying cause of histamine intolerance is that diamine oxidase, or DAO, deficiency, which leads to defective homeostasis, right?